All right. Under the motion, this House believes that it is within the interest of Sendoinia citizens to take arms and march to another violent protest against Tinosuba regime. To start the debate, I'm calling upon Prime Minister. Here.
Audible and visible.
Yes, visible and audible.
Okay, your eyes, just unmute yourself. I'll start my speech in three, two, one. When the new regime no longer serves the people, and when there is already signs that the people is going to be oppressed and the people is going to be silenced, that's the time for free people to not act so cooperative and to actually stand up for their democratic rights. Very proud to be standing on proposition today. Just diving right into setup then. Firstly, what's the context of Sendoinia actually look like? I think I'll just divide this into two parts, into the Suratno era and into the Tinosuba era. The Suratno era, as the context site tells you, is basically like a very oppressive regime where they suppress a lot of free speech, violent state responses on protesters, mass corruption, collusion, hyperinflation, and etc. Like what it looks like then is whenever you're living in a country where the dictator basically appoints the people yang penting jilat dia, and what makes it happen is that whenever there is corruption, then there is not a lot of accountability inside the government in the very first place because the entire cabinet and the entire like structure of the government itself is all appointed by the Suratno. And this provoked a lot of people to protest, of course, which resulted in Suratno becoming impeached and followed up with a more democratic election in the Sendoinia nation. But then it was followed up by the Tinosuba era, who, while was democratic elected, his policies all failed, and like this resulted the entire country to still fall into an economic crisis anyway, and also there's a lot of militarization and also an increased restriction towards the right of speech because of the censorship towards like critics about the country and etc. So if we look at it in an objective point of view, the condition of Sendonia right now in this motion is that the Suratno era and the Tinosuba era is very neck to neck, right? The only difference is that Tinosuba was democratically elected by the people of Sendonia, but this is because firstly, the actions of Tinosuba, I'm just going to explain about this. I think like Tinosuba's past relation with Suratno's regime in of itself speaks for itself. Even if he has experienced interest in distancing themselves on from the regime, as stated in the context slide, the fact that he was even involved in the regime in the first place shows that he shares a similar mindset to Suratno. Why is that? Simple. It's because Suratno did a lot of crinonism, right? That is that, which means that the way you get into a position of power during Suratno's administration and during his regime is that you would have to suck up to him and you would have to have like a very similar mindset towards him, meaning that there's two possible solutions towards what the characterization of Tinosuba is. Either A, he is just as corrupt as Suratno and he is just as basically like messed up in the head as Suratno because he believes that there is no right towards the democratic towards the people of this nation. But also there's the second choice, but that is that Tinosuba doesn't have an actual stance and doesn't have a backbone, just as like what he and just does what he is told, which is frankly isn't fit to become a president anyways, and that's why all of the policies that is happening right now is actually also a fault of his administration. But secondly, then let's just characterize in the interest of the people. I give three interests. Firstly, they want change. They want a better country and a better leader as well, because no one wants to live in a country that keeps on suppressing their right towards speech. They don't want to live in a country that's economic, always having like hyperinflation, always having bad policies and etc. But secondly, they also want to preserve their rights, their right to speech, their right to have education, and all of that, all of which is currently in danger with the status quo within the current regime anyways. And also thirdly, they want to have a safe country and also a safe protest. So then thirdly, then what is the ideal outcome that we posit to you, and what is the goal of proposition side? I think that we want there to be a re-election to be held by using protests and nationwide violent protests to convey a large message towards the current government regarding the people's dissatisfaction of what is happening with the current administration. This can look like two ways they can protest. Firstly is the violent protest and the physical thing that's going to be happening in real life, right? What the comparison we can use right now in like actual news is the DPR protest, where a lot of people charged right into the administration and did a lot of like violent things nationwide to physically convey to the people and the news anchor that the dissatisfaction of the country is really that big. But secondly, it can also go towards advocacy online, which is usually going to be used by younger people who are still not legal adults but still want to express their opinion and their democratic right. They usually go online and do a lot of do posts, do videos, and etc. to spread awareness as a nationwide emergency. One argument then on why this violent protest is worth it in the very first place. Let's contextualize them. Why violent protest in the very first place? I think that the Tinosuba regime is already taking action to suppress the voices of the people in the very first place, meaning that we can no longer stay cooperative, because the cooperative and like being cooperative towards the country means that you will be easier to be silenced as well. B, this has shown to be successful during the Suratno era, meaning that the moral of the crowd in of itself is still there because it was shown to be successful before. That is that if someone wants to do like some type of narrative that says like, oh, all of this is going to be zero sum game because no government is going to listen to you, the fact that there has been historical proof that this type of thing has resulted in the impeachment of a president before shows to you and the entire public that this type of thing is not an impossible dream for them to achieve. So even if opposition wants to say that it's going to be unsafe towards the people and hence why it's not within their interest, I think a couple things. A, humans will always have the rationality and to protect themselves during rioting, right? Or there's a lot of precautions and there's a lot of like awareness towards this type of thing, like i.e. putting toothpaste under your eye to help with tear gas, or like wearing protective clothes and etc. That is one rationality thing. Whenever people are going down in real life and actually rioting, that is one thing that they will think as well. But B, even if those people don't exist and some people are going to think very radically, because we do admit it's a very dark place in the country and there are going to be some people who are very very mad about the situation, we introduce a comparative of what might happen if you don't protest violently in the very first place. That is to say, you will slowly become more oppressed in the very first place, right? If you do not do this violent protest, what happens is that you will slowly and be silently silenced by the government in of itself, and the outcome of that is much harder and much like more negative when in comparison whenever you actually use your democratic right to speak towards the dissatisfaction towards the discrimination. See, even if the government does decide to act violently and directly suppress their own citizens for speaking out on their right, I feel like international relation and all of this, the whole thing about rioting doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Meaning the entire country is not going to be existing in a vacuum. That means that whenever there is news that a country is directly violating international law, directly violating human rights law, there is going to be some type of intervention by international laws and also the UN and etc. But what would Sendonia actually look like after? Directly, because there's this type of like aggressive type of response, is going to get some deterrence towards the future candidates in the next election. For those reasons, very proud to be on.
Thank you, PM, for that speech. Now to open the cases from opposition calling upon LO. Here.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, clear.
Okay, hold on for a bit. Set up my timer. Okay, start my speech. In three, two, one. I would like to say that objectively, it is actually not the same, right? Because the difference between the Suratno versus Tinosuba era is that the fact that in Tinosuba era, it's already way more modern. We can assume that, it's current modern age, i.e. there's social media involved, there's much more bigger organizations involved, and people are much more aware of what's actually going on, right? So their meaning, then there is like certain set of alternative that is much safer for people and other minority groups, as well as the transitions towards weakening the power of the government, right? Before going into my speech, a few points of rebuttals first. I think firstly, there's little to no likelihood analysis coming from side of government. The ideal action or the ideal outcome that they try to explain, try to prove Instead of fiat, there should be a really good process analysis to explain why suddenly, for example, violent protest can lead to a new elections, why then violent protests can be that successful, for example, because there is no explanations on why then violent protests are able to actually overthrow the current government. The explanation is coming from it happened back then, it can happen now. But we will explain to you why then it's unlikely to happen twice, right? But the second thing, we questions whether we need to have like human rights violations to that extent, and then we're able to get international how, for example, and etc. In our side of the house, we don't want any human rights violation anymore, right? We don't want to for people to get harmed or the citizen to get harmed, especially the minority groups to get harmed. But thirdly, exactly, they explain that there is the rationality of people to keep themselves safe. The thing is, inside of a violent protest, people probably more think about themselves, right? Meaning, if they see like other kind of violent actions in front of their eyes, other kind of anarchism, for example, they will not think. They will probably just try to save themselves. We think this is also hurtful for other type of like for example, minority groups that became the black sheep inside of violent protests because everyone is just doing violence anyway. And it's so easy to be and the action is so easy to be infiltrated by like other type of groups that are aligning themselves with the government. But at the end of the day, even if people are able to keep themselves safe, we question what happened then. What happened then after the violent protest ends, right? Before going into my arguments, 3 points of setup. Firstly, I think it's fair to assume that dictatorship will not came as easy no longer, right? For example, like just sort of for 3 decades. So we can assume that in the next elections, more likely that this Tinosuba will not get elected. We'll also explain why it's likely with the way that the alternatives that we're going to propose. It's like Tinosuba will not get elected anyway. But the second is on the burden of proof. Governments explain that they want a re-elections, so they need to prove that. Why there's a chances of them to be able to have free elections after the violent protest. But there's also need to prove there is a chances of re-electability, for example, of Tinosuba. That's why there is this violence became very, very urgent or why it's justified. Instead of opposition, I think we just need to prove why the violent protest is not urgent to do since there's a lot of harm regarding to it. But thirdly, on the characterizations, I think in Suratno, notice that it is in 3 decades, right? There's already obviously a lot of protests going on that lasted for months, probably years even. There's a lot of events going on that leads into that moment of Suratno getting overthrown. But second, there's this hyperinflations going on in the Suratno era, right? Meaning that high-ranking officials already getting the impact. Two things: one, they probably already never had a chance to be like to be a higher-ranking positions because it's all about cronies. So they see this chance for them to be able to also help the people to overturn the government for them to be elect as something else. But second, the economic problem makes them to get impact as well, because if they are not the Suratno's most beloved officials, then they're probably also getting will be done anyway, right? So this is why they are able to be swayed. But in the Tinosuba, the difference is then two things. Firstly, the economic premise is not as insane as it was in the Suratno, meaning it's not hyperinflation. But second, I think that opposition parties existed inside of Tinosuba. It's why it's not a dictatorship. It's still democracy in the end. And the opposition party also likely will still not help because there is a better alternative for people to opt in, right? But the thing is, inside there is also this modern era, right? Meaning, sure, yeah, obviously people do social media, but the thing is, the protests that are happening will probably be much better coming from social media, just to keep the pressure on, to keep the awareness high, right? So going to my argument then, on why then violent protests are very, very high risk with no guaranteed benefit. Firstly, why it is unlikely to be succeed, right? Two things. Firstly, people want to gather as much masses as possible, right? Meaning it's less likely about what kind of people are there inside of the protest, especially when you talk about violent protests. Meaning it's more likely to be infiltrated by the spies or by distractions coming from the states themselves, right? Meaning they will be more likely to shift to anarchy, or if there is an anarchy coming from the spies, they are able to blame it and shift the blame into the people that do the protest. This leads to a high level of repressions, right? Of not just voices, but also violent repressions, justifying there's military presence, justifying there's police using tear gas, justifying police to already block, certain barricade and etc. Right? Meaning the safety of the people is not guaranteed anymore, because the idea is that when you want to lead violent protests, you already have this mindset that whatever going to happen happens. It's fine if you're going to beat up. It's fine if you beat other people up. But second, it's trickle down to the minority community, right? Notice that what happened in the Suratno era with the political political repression, they also more likely repress the minority community because they're seen treated as the black sheep, right? So there's this stances for them to be violent, then they're also probably going to be violent to to the minority community, and the idea that they are black sheep, and that's fine for them to be violent at. This is what we don't want in the current the modern era of Sendoinia. The fact that minority groups should be protected and should not get the same precautions back then. So sacrifice can only be justified if there is actually bigger benefit. To likelihood explanation when there is no benefit. Firstly, it's not a dictatorship regime, so it's more likely that Tinosuba will not be elected in the next election. But second, back in Suratno era, there is only one coalition, right? In the Tinosuba, more likely there is still opposition figures or opposition political parties. This is why it's still he is still able to be vote in a democratic way, right? But what is then the alternative, right, of Suratno? The alternative in Tinosuba, right? Since we're currently in the digital era, it's still safer for the people to keep the pressure on to spread even more awareness, to also help NGOs, organization, for example, that do try to spread the awareness, right? Since what we want is likely the likelihood for him to not be elected becoming way higher, right? Also, sure, there is probably voices that are being repressed, but the degree of repressiveness comparing to the era of Suratno is very, very different. Right now, people still have choices, and this is what they don't have inside of Suratno. That's why it leads to a violent protest. In the current, we do now have choices, and this is why better for the people, especially when we want the better outcome for every individual spread to oppose.
Thank you, LO, for that speech. To continue the cases from government calling upon DPM. Here.
Check, am I audible?
Yes, audible.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me set up my timer really quick. I'm gonna be covering some slightly sensitive topics, so I'm just gonna give a slight warning beforehand. POI preferred just by unmuting yourself or just in the chat box. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. When a government fails to protect citizens' basic rights, the social contract is broken then, right? Citizens have a moral right to overthrow it. When you imagine yourself in the shoes of these citizens, simply just think. They're not just simply risking their lives for an abstract political ideology. They're not simply risking their life because they're just, wanting to overthrow. They are risking their lives because the status quo under the current region that they are in is already killing them through the systemic starvation, hyperinflation, and state neglect that the government has already failed to give them. When, for example, a mother cannot feed her children or a father cannot buy basic medicine due to these costs that hyperinflation exists, the risk calculus changes, right? Staying at home means a slow, certain death. At the very least, from our side, we give you a mechanism that at least has more of a chance at a future for these citizens, and it is within the interest of these citizens to at least act. They won't just sit down and protect themselves because they won't be safe either way. I'll prove the likelihood under my clashes then. But a few clarifications about the likelihood. The government has a interest to pay attention to the democracy of the people when you do these violent protests, because one, it is within the role of the government, right? People from the Supreme Court would have at least would not just simply ignore these citizens when they are essentially affecting them in a direct way when you put them in a violent protest type of context. But then two, even not, there is still something called international pressure that will continue to at the very least take notice to these Supreme Court leaders or the people that rule over the reign. But then there's two things I want to ask under this debate today. One, the right or the justification to act for these citizens, but then two, the characterization and likelihood under both sides of the house. First point then, on the right to act. The premise here is simple. Under the current administration, issues like hyperinflation, currency devaluation, and the removal of basic necessities have pushed millions to extreme poverty and starvation, let's say, right? Let's make the characterization of these citizens clearer. What kind of people are these people like? These are citizens who tried to play by the rules of the democracy, right? But they were entirely abandoned by the system and instead betrayed by the system. These are people who voted and filed legal petitions and marched peacefully in the past only to watch the judiciary protect the corrupt elite and have their government fail them essentially. Half their government failed them essentially. There's two issues under this, right? First point on the core interest of the citizen. A. These citizens would have the extremity of immediate survival, right? Why then does opposition's method of protest fail? It simply just takes way too long or takes months and years to influence the policy while hunger and the state of the state just becomes more dire and worsen under their side of the house. But then comparatively, our side instead forces an instant state emergency intervention and concussions because exactly we give you something that is more immediate and more extreme to the core to the point where it cannot simply be shaken off or be ignored. The primary interest of any citizen is the preservation of their own dignity, right? A high intensity disruptive uprising creates an instant crisis for these elites, halting like normal governance and economic extraction. This just forces the state to make an immediate emergency concussion to restore disorder, and it aligns directly to the interest of the citizens' urgent need for survivability, right? But then why is this urgent and important then? Here's the premise, Judge. Gradual political reforms and peaceful marches takes years to yield results. This is what oppositions want. However, when a citizen faces immediate existential threats such as hyperinflation, hunger, and other types of things that immediately take risk to their state, time is a luxury that they do not have. Slow institutional methods cannot solve a crisis when people are currently starving today and need help immediately. But then B, the systematic accountability that is effective under our side of the house. There's two nuances under this. One, when political institution courts or these bodies are like thoroughly compromised, they serve the ruling class rather than the public. They only cater towards the elite. In a closed loop, writing like letters or just marching peacefully or protesting peacefully under social media is entirely ineffective and doesn't really like cater toward, doesn't make them listen to these citizens. But then two, would accountable elites rarely yield power or privileges willingly out of like moral persuasion. You can't just simply persuade them or just complain about it online and they would listen to you, right? They would only negotiate when their personal safety, wealth, and hold on power are directly threatened. A confrontational protest speaks the only language that these elites would understand or at the very least listen to, the threat of total disruption to that state. This is what they're going to answer to. And because simply you do not just want to like make your state turn into some sort of like total chaos and like some sort of fire pit, obviously you would listen and you would like at the very least see on the suffering of the people, even if they are going to be characterized as somebody as awful as that. But then let's just talk about why these violent protests are uniquely needed and why does it link to this what the citizens would want. One, it is uniquely needed because it represents the only mechanism capable of matching the extreme structural nature of the crisis that they are contextually in, right? When the standard system are entirely broken, a confrontational approach is no longer just an option. It becomes the only logical tool left to defend the population's survival. But then let's just picturize and just tie it back into the likelihood on what Sendoinia would look like after. This is directly extending from den of speech. It would cause simply the premise here is simple. It would cause a deterrence for future candidates in the next election because the analysis here is that a confrontational uprising permanently rewrites or like essentially changes the idea and the standard between rulers and the people who are within the government versus the people who are within the citizens. By showing that citizens can and will physically threaten the elite's hold on power, it establishes at least an active fear and for a force of accountability for these governors. For decades after the event, any future government will think twice before implementing predatory taxes or like devaluing the currency or because they know that it would trigger another existential uprising. And simply put, people would not just simply like want to cause that in the future, right? Because they understand on what the citizens are capable of and this will cause a deterrence effect. But let's talk about the second point then about the impact on long-term and the likelihood and the unique reasons of why violent protest is conceptually unique. Because instead of like this does not look like just random looting or like burning down local markets. The disruption is strictly aimed at the state and the ruling class. This is what Deneuve tried to tell you in her argument, right? Because these citizens would target the economic lifelines that fund the state, like such as state-owned enterprises and elite-owned monopolies and major government logistics hubs. By shutting down and occupying these key areas, the protest starves the government of its financial resource base while leaving civilian infrastructures untouched, or at least not as violent as what opposition tried to posit to you, which is why all those reasons very proud to be on.
All right, thank you, DPM, for that speech. Before continuing, quick reminder: don't forget to try over and also take POI. Yeah. To continue calling upon DLO. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, audible.
Okay. My pronouns she, her. If you want POI, please POI verbally. I will not be looking at the Zoom chat. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to thank the proposition team for spending 5 minutes explaining why democracy is important and why Tinosuba's era is bad anyways, because opposition fully agrees on that, right? But I want to say that this is not what the debate is about. Panels, a few rebuttals before I move on to my extension. Some of my responses are going to be integrated into my extensions. First rebuttal. There is no likelihood analysis at all, panels, in what they're saying. For example, how and the process analysis of why would there be a re-election if that's what proposition team wants hasn't been explained at all. What they've spent doing is tell you why democracy is important and why Tinosuba's era is bad and why Tinosuba shouldn't be a leader and whatnot, right? I think it's pretty obvious that we all consensusly agree on that. But what we're doing and what this debate is about is weighing why is sacrificing people's lives, which will happen during a violent demonstration, for example, is worth and is worth all of the likelihood analysis that they give you at the end, right? If they cannot prove that to you, why is hurting people's lives and hurting minorities and whatnot will eventually succeed in forming a reformation, because we tell you that it's not feasible at all, panels. But moving on to my extension then, still on feasibility, why violent protests is unlikely to succeed anyways at the end of the day. Panels, what's the prerequisite of a successful reformation? We tell you that it includes having a big mass that will risk their life, that is pushed to the brink of desperation, that they want to risk their lives in order to, fight for something that's not even guaranteed, right? But first point, but we tell you that less people are going to join in the mass in the modern era because of one, trauma and fear. Twofold analysis on this. A, in the present, from past violence, especially minority groups like the Chinese, choose to save themselves instead. This is the politics of forgetting. Why would I want to remember and reenact all of the past violence that has happened to my ancestors, in which they were burned inside their houses when they were asleep, in which they were hit to death, in which they were, quote unquote, the trigger warning, raped, right? People choose to not participate out of fear. Even parents from majority groups tell their kids to not join. My Chinese parents fear for my life and tell me, jangan turun demo, for example. All of this is true because people don't want to die or their kids to die, right? This is then unfortunately could lead to internal conflicts anyways between Sendoinia citizens, for example, between people who will risk their life and people who will not, which possibly cause major rifts at the end of the day. People are just not going to band together. Plus, during Suratno's era, there was a clear split already between the small number of elites and the people in the grassroots area. While during the modern era, in Tinosuba's regime, people were able to climb up the levels and be rich. So those people, obviously, they will not join. And even worse, privileged people might just turn against or, not hinder people in the grassroots area because they're doing violent protests that the rich deem as unimportant. For example, why are you making the streets closed down and whatnot? Why are you ruining the public transportation and whatnot, right? But B, what happens after the violent protest if we go through with it? First layer, there is no guarantee at all, panels, from their likelihood analysis, none at all, that the violent protest will end up in a reformation. Under prop, the moment we fail, people are going to be even more scared to speak up from the already imperfect, say, freedom of speech because of the bloody aftermath that we're going to have. They saw people getting shot, dying, etc. The people who are still survive or alive after the violent demonstration, for example, they will probably be down, right? But second, say that we succeed, there's going to be a vacuum of power that happens after we overthrow Tinosuba, which what's most likely going to happen is that the vacuum will be filled in a rush because because it was overthrown by a violent demonstration, right? By someone who holds a significant amount of power right now, which is probably not going to be someone good, right? This is especially likely because presidential election takes a very long time to prepare. We would rather have an actual democratic process on the next presidential election because you can actually then take your time to evaluate the candidates to ensure that the presidential election goes fairly, yeah, and their party's history and whatnot, right? So this is non-existent under proposition side of the House, which means that solvency of getting a better leader is probably going to not exist under their side, exclusively under our side only. But second point then, why is this is not feasible? High-ranking politicians we have proven to you are unlikely to help with backing the masses if we do a violent protest. 2 points. A, what's unique about the violent demonstration was the fact that there were already an uprising coming from inside the ranks during Suratno's era, right? Politicians were not happy about him holding absolute power for 30 years. So a lot of them actually supported and backed up the violent demonstration, the uprising that the Mahasiswa did during his era, right? But right now, there is no uprising inside the politicians coming from Tinosuba's era. More so, they're banding together because they feel like mahasiswa always thinks that everything they try to do is evil anyways and whatnot, right? But B, high-ranking politicians are afraid to join because there are other alternatives, unlike in the past where they have no choice because there is absolute power. But now we do have other opposition parties and whatnot, right? But second, they're also afraid of what might happen to them and their family if the violent demonstration fails. What then? If they try to support with the power that they hold right now as a politician, what if it fails, right? They also think that way, of course. But three, it's harder to filter government cronies anyways who will, if we go down on demonstration, want to escalate those demonstrations, which probably going to lead to even more aggression coming from and violent repression coming from the cops and the army and whatnot. For example, like we've seen during past demonstration, even though it was not violent at all, what happens when it is a violent demonstration? Even worse, retaliation, even more people are going to die. And four, democratic rules dictate that, say, the president only has a limited amount of time as a democratic country, right? So it's not an authoritarian regime anymore. It's impossible for Tinosuba to rule for 3 decades, which lessen their urgency even further to want to sacrifice people's life. But what do we say is the better alternative panels? We tell you that we can still keep pressure and say that we are unhappy using peaceful methods, i.e., keeping pressure and critiquing politics on social media, for example, talking with other people, doing peaceful demonstrations, right? What we are doing, for example, in Indonesia right now. So those are the ways that we can still keep pressure on the government to say that we are unhappy. Like this is likely because the degree of repression was higher during Suratno's era, where there's no social media, people had to operate underground, which makes it easier for them to get kidnapped. At least under our side of the house, we tell you we still have freedom of speech, although it's not perfect. As long as we can collectively agree and keep pressure that we're not happy, the next period, the next presidential election, we won't choose Tinosuba anymore. And that's why we have solvency under our side of the house anyways. Proud to propose.
Thank you, dear all, for that speech. Now calling upon Government Whip. Here.
Check, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, for PLI, I can just unmute. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. As for the nation to grow, what they need is hope, and we tell you that when they have seen the way our last dictator got taken down, they will have the hope and belief to take them down again. Our stance is clear. What we want from the beginning is to let history repeat itself, to let re-election happen again. If what opposition is trying to push to you is a caliber approach, we will prove to you why on our side it is more effective and more urgent. Opposition cannot downplay on what 1 year can do to a country, because the longer you let Tinosuba rule, the more your economic will crash and the more it will harm your people, right? Opposition told you that hyperinflation can also affect on the to the people on the higher upper side. So hence they will help. A,
I feel like this is untrue. The thing about hyperinflation, it will be much more likely to benefit these higher status people. Why? Because they have the money, they already have the privilege at the very first place to invest, to buy assets in foreign money, in foreign stocks, for example, like USD and stuff like that, meaning that this will only make them become richer, and the poor just becomes poorer, right? But B, there are also no likelihood on how this could happen. So our case still stands because these higher status people, at the end of the day, they still have the safety net to begin with. But I just want to simply clarify that kids will not go down the street to do violent protest. This has already been preempted by the NEF before, right? So yeah, moving on to my first issue then. Here's the thing, right? The urge to do a violent protest does not come from thin air. That is to say, the moment the government has been marked by consistently failing their useless policies that have plunged our state into an economic crisis and stuff like that, right? Stuff like that. Meaning that when this happened, there has already been protests. There have been critics in social media left and right. There have been discourse left and right. People just do not go and suddenly try to like burn down the building or whatsoever. They have tried to complain. But the fact that the government could stop it at any moment, but they don't, it's not because they can, but because they simply refuse to listen. So at the end of the day, this has already proved to you that violence does not come from thin air. A lot of attempts has already been made. Told you that it is better to take it in social media, but here's the thing, right? All people and people in power, like they say, is wouldn't firstly all people, they are not that likely to open social media, but people in power, they also wouldn't care enough. Exactly why you have to go down the street so you can get more attention. We instead flip their premise. We say that exactly we still have our rights now. We have to make use of our right, our right to speak before it is fully taken away from us. Exactly, they're framing about the Tinosuba era being more modern. Is why the likelihood of successful riot is higher, because right to democracy is also a right to do a demo, to do a protest. Ellen have explained to you on what will happen if you don't do it immediately, right? But yeah, simply put on a comparative, when a government faces zero physical on economy resistance, it naturally pushes the boundaries of its powers, right? Leading to absolute authoritarianism. Continuous radical protest draws a hard line in the sand. It communicates the regime that there is severe cost to expanding oppressive policies, and this is what opposition's word is gonna look like. Here's the thing, right? If we go to the case where people get hurt because of this protest, I think there's still aksi warga jaga warga, meaning that these citizens, these protesters, know that they're in the same fight, that they're together. They are likely to help each other, just like the demo that has happened earlier, where these citizens, they like buy each other food, they like prepare aids for other protesters and stuff like that. But if people get hurt that bad, I feel like there's still UN, right? The moment there's news about you hurting your own people in democracy, the moment you physically hurt them, UN can step in, because it correlates to things like human rights, right? Especially if you correlate it to the characterization that opposition have given to you about the modern era, where there's like a lot of things in social media, right? Yeah, but opposition question to you, what will happen then after the violent protest, even if we're safe? Here's the thing, right? We have explained to you from the very beginning what we're aiming here for is change. So when people are safe, then good, change will happen. But when there's re-election, even in the very worst case scenario where the new president is in the same bracket with a similar personality, or they share the same quality, then at least we can have deterrence for future candidates in the next election, where they will be more afraid to mess up, or else, yeah, people are just gonna go violent and history is just gonna repeat itself, right? So, but yeah, what did opposition tell you? They tell you instead that, oh, we can rely on the opposing party. But here's the thing: if you want to rely on opposing party, then yeah, firstly you have to explain the likelihood to us, which you haven't done, by the way. But two, even then, if it works, that just means that there will be no deterrence for future candidate, because there wasn't a violent protest to begin with. They are not that afraid if they mess up or stuff like that, because they haven't experienced the situation where people just get enraged and, yeah, go violent down the street. We win this debate then based on two metrics. A, on time sensitivity. We tell you that the moment you go down the street, it means that you will get a faster response either from the government or from the UN. But we say that even if we fail, it will only show how faulty the administration is, making these citizens become more angry and enraged at the situation. We explain to you from the NEF about urgency. When people feel like they are being faulted, that will just cause more attempts from them, right? But B, on urgency, we have explained to you on why at the end of the day, this is the fastest solution, and the time is over. Thank you.
Thank you, Government Whip, for that speech. Now calling upon Opposition Whip. Here.
Checking if I'm audible.
Yes, audible.
Okay, wait. Starting my speech. FYI, please unmute. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We agree that the current regime is bad. We agree that the system is failing the underprivileged and the working class. But eventually, this is still a debate about a movement, about politics. So ultimately, the most important thing to prove is not how severe the current oppression and suppression of voices here in our current society is, because that is a concession judge. But the most important thing is to prove the likelihood of success of each side's preferred strategy. So long as they aren't able to prove why, that it is very likely for re-election to happen, which is a very large burden that they've taken, by the way, that they cannot win this debate. Firstly, I want to say, please ignore the GovWhip's contribution about how UN will help. Not only this is a very late contribution, but I think this is something that is very unlikely, because we're talking about the UN here, the same UN who won't even help Gaza and other war-ridden countries. I question the likelihood of them suddenly wanting to help Sendoinia in the brink of like a collapse of a government regime, right? So I don't understand this contribution at all. But let's examine their entire case. I think the main goal that they want is they literally want a re-election. But the problem with their case is that they never really proved the likelihood. But I'm going to explain further why it is not likely to happen right now, despite having it being successful again. I think both my previous speakers have already extended quite nicely about why the current situation and right now and back then is not really the same, and therefore proving why it's not as simple as what they try. But I'm going to extend this further. I think at best, their case about like masses, about the disappointment of citizens, etc., about how the system fails them, only proves why people have the motivation to protest, but not really. But the thing is, the problem with their case is having large masses doesn't actually guarantee success. Why? We've already explained to you by many different things, because their goal is big, right? Their goal that they claim is to literally overthrow the government, not just for a policy change, but to literally overthrow the government and get re-election. But this is very, very difficult, because in order to literally overthrow the government, it takes lots of backing. It takes lots of people in power willing to help you, higher ranking politicians to pull the strings and help the masses in order to weaken the power inside of the office. But why is this needed? Why is this something that is important? Because the power of masses alone is easily diluted by the government because of many things. This is why when my LO tell you that there's going to be infiltration that can allow Tinosuba to weaken and damp the masses' power, becomes very, very crucial, because this is something that never really mitigate in the very first place. Because when we're talking about violent protest, there's really minimal check and balance to
pick and choose the people who is currently in the movement. Leader of protests are going to only focus on gathering as much masses as possible because that's the only way that you can literally overthrow a government. This is why infiltration is easily to happen because we're focusing on gathering as much as people possible. There's minimal filtering system. So that's why the impact is that minority groups are going to be at risk because there's going to be people justifying violence, and that violence is often targeted towards the minority groups. But secondly, it also justifies government use and arms of tear gases that literally takes the lives of the people. But I'm going to extend further on why officials won't be as easily persuaded and threatened, because this is one of their main likelihood, right? Because the politicians are going to feel threatened that they're going to be forced to take action. Why won't this happen? As simple as because these politicians are rich, and that's the problem with our current government. They could literally just run to another country while people are raiding their house, for instance. Like, look at what happened to Ahmad Sahroni, for instance. Because when we're talking about politicians, but I'm going to explain the likelihood further. When we're talking about politicians and officials, we need to examine their rationality because politicians love power. They want to maintain it as much as possible. And I think this is a very intuitive and very charitable characterization, right? But the problem is we need to examine that there are two different politicians in this scenario. Ones who are in the current office, who are ruling right now, and one who was in the oppositional party. And I'm going to explain why both of these politicians are not likely to concede and suddenly enact a policy change and overthrow a government. First, on the POV of politicians in the office, simply because they don't want to give up the power that they currently have. Literally, the goal that government wants is to overthrow the government, to create a re-election and literally put them out of the power. And whatever changes is proves that whatever changes and compromise that these politicians in power want to make, it's still not going to be enough so long as they're still in office. And this is likely, right, in the context of there being violent protests, because people are emotional, people are angry, people want the politicians to be out of power right now, because that's also the strategy of violent protest, is to invoke as much emotions as possible, make people as angry as possible, and therefore motivating them to go down the streets and riot against the government, even though it's very risky, right? But in the POV of the politicians in the opposition party, why they also are not likely to help the protests and like help them in order to, in terms of creating a re-election. I think it's important to examine why politicians back then are different, and why politicians back then are different from right now, and why they politicians during the Suratno era want to help the people, therefore creating the success that they did have back then. It's because back then they had no other choice. It is a dictatorship. There's no other way to gain power. There's no other way to gain power. The only option that they have is to literally like overthrow the dictatorship regime. But right now they have a choice, that is to wait until the next election season to get elected, right? Because there's an internal risk calculation here. Because the risk, if the protests fail and they have been known to be contributed to like violate to, and because if the protests fail and these politicians are known to have contributed to the protest, they will get scrutinized much more by the current government officials, and the current government officials who are in power will do as what they can to dampen their power, making it virtually impossible to get elected in the next season. This is why my DLO's explanation on vacuum of power is really, really important. Because even in the best case that they want to help, and the reason why they want to help is so they can fill the vacancy of power. The proof, even in the best case, government is overthrown, why the new regime wouldn't be much better than the current one, because it's going to be filled by someone who has the most power. But importantly, it backlashes the principle is democracy, because who views the demonstration, because the problem is the new person who is going to fill the vacancy of power is not going to be someone who is elected by the people. This is how democracy fails, when the new leader is not elected by the citizens, right? This is why proving why alternative is better is to just wait until the next election to continue the soft pressure. Because even if it's true that yes, it's going to take so long for like peaceful protest to be able to bear fruit, right? But it's not going to take decades as what they seem to try to portray. It will probably only take at best 2 years or 3 years until the next election season. But that's why it's important to maintain that soft power and democracy so people will continue to be disappointed. And that's how we're going to save Sendoinia. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Opposition Whip, for that speech. Now, to conclude the whole cases from opposition calling upon opposition reply. Here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, audible.
Okay, cool.
Start my speech. 3, 2, 1. Government explained that violent protest has a deterrence effect. It's actually a flawed logic. Because what happened in Suratno is there is a violent protest, but what happened next is there is still Tinosuba, right? So it proved that violent protest is never going to be deterrence effect for bad politicians or for bad presidents, right? What the prerequisite is that the idea is people are going to put less trust on the government in our side of the house. So there's like no, so this is why there's like non-violent protest, putting more awareness, keep on putting pressure, right? This is the when DLO and LO already say there is this divisions of people inside of side of government. So how then the violent protest will be able to commerce, right? Judge, I think opposition wants the something that would raise less risk with basically minimum risk but more tangible benefit, right? Two things. One, we want the weakening of the government power and pushing the awareness to the people, right? What does it lead to? It leads to the last chance of the Tinosuba to be re-elected in the next elections. This is much more likely to happen, and the likelihood analysis is already very, very extensive in all our substantive speakers, right? Government case is very, very hard to prove, right? They sort of still play in the best case that it will work, but they really don't know how exactly it's going to work, right? They explain that, well, we're going to have shutdown or we're going to show disruptions, but so what, right? The characteristic of the officials, we already explained it's how different they are, right? And what's the difference, basically? I think all of my speakers already explained beforehand. In Suratno, there's 30 years of dictatorships and there's hyperinflation. Officials feels like there is no chance for them except if they actually help the masses. And what is then their chance is that it is that vacuum of power that both my DLO and speaker already explained. The vacuum of power is the chances for officials of Suratno era to become the leaders, right? But again, we already explained it's not guaranteed to be good. These officials are not guaranteed to be good anyway. They can also be corrupt. So even in the best case of government side, that there is a fact that there is a election or re-elections and this Tinosuba is overthrown, right? There is that vacuum of power that, like it or not, is going to be rushed. Like it or not, it's going to be someone that probably still have ties with Tinosuba or someone who still have cronies. What meaning that two things. Firstly, they really never explains what is then the likelihood analysis or how exactly then they're able to achieve it. We're the one that proved to you why there is probably vacuum of power. But the second is that they still need to prove why then vacuum of power is a good thing or why then the elections of the next politician or the next president is guaranteed to be good, right? They never explain all of that in their side of the house. In our side, what's going to happen is much more tangible, Judge. When we're going to keep the pressure on the government, it's not like suddenly we're just going to like to stop the certain demonstration or to stop like the awareness coming to social media or in certain NGOs organizations, for example. We're still going to keep the pressure on. We're still going to keep on relying all of the bad things that the government did, right? What we're not going to do is not going to do violent protests. We're not going to harm other people. We're not going to create black sheep out of the minority communities any longer, right? Well, what we want is that in the next elections, there is a guarantee that Tinosuba is not going to be re-elected or his cronies, right? We want maybe better politicians, better leaders, and we have time to prepare for it. We have time to make sure that the people understand that we don't want any more Tinosuba, we don't want any more Suratno. What we want is a better leaders and better leaders and better presidents or better politicians at the end of the day, right? And this is still likely for us to likely in our side of the house to happen. The idea of there is right now social media, the idea on how we're able to spread awareness much better. The idea, even if the voices are being repressed, it's the degree of repression is still completely different comparing to the Suratno era. People can still gather, people can still have communities to talk about the government, to criticize the current government, right? And there's also the fact that there is multiple choices, right? There is a different type of opposition parties, different type of political figures that the people can support comparing to in the Suratno era where there's literally no options, and the only thing that you can do is just hope that there is the people that feel the vacuum of power is good. What's happening inside of government is they agree that there will be a vacuum of power, and they agree that there is probably not the good officials that will fill the power. They agree there will be injustice to the minority groups because they're just going to be violent protests at the end of the day, proud to oppose.
Thank you, opposition reply for that speech. Now calling upon government reply. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, audible.
Okay, hold on a sec. I need to adjust my timer really quick. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think this entire chamber is 50-50 when it comes to the characterization of these citizens. I think the most important delta of this debate is to determine whether or not these citizens would have the interest and the importance of violent protests and why it should be like why on government side it should be unique. Government side would have to uniquely prove why violent protests would be more within the interest of these citizens, while opposition have to explain the burden of why these citizens would rather do passive protests. That's what the debate should be about. I don't think the idea on success or the likelihood of success of being able to overthrow an entire government is as important, and it should have been instead on characterization, right? A few issues that I have coming from opposition is that opposition simply cannot downplay how you can destroy a country within a year. The longer that you let Tinosuba in the office is going to cause more a catastrophic state. I think the idea on how violent protests can cause immediate distress wasn't mitigated because there was a clear reality that a government would simply not ignore the chaos, right? And it is also important to note the fact that when you let Tinosuba in the office, it's just going to cause the citizens to be more angry and get more angrier and angrier, causing them to have more of an aligning interest into doing these violent protests. But secondly, the alternatives that opposition gives isn't as effective or viable because, simply put, citizens have tried doing this method of protest before, right? They were ignored instead and were left to rot. The urgency of the attention and the framing of time sensitivity that government gives paves a better characterization for how citizens can make use of their rights in the current fight for survivability. This also ties in as to why they would be more likely to do these violent protests in the first place, because exactly this is the characterization that we already pushed to you from the get-go. But then I also think that the deterrence effect that came from opposition's case from reply is also really late, so I don't think that should be credited either. But then lastly, the violent protests that were characterized under opposition, I think wasn't engaging enough because, simply put, government gave you an idea on what the violent protests would not just be some like simple random raids and attacking other people as their method. Government gave you a picture on what it would look like attacking specific state properties, for example, and actually draining the elite people that are more specific rather than just going on the street and just punching a random person on the face, because that's simply not how violent protest works. But then let's just sum it up on a clear clash regarding the interest of the citizen and the time sensitivity. What did opposition tell you? Their entire case was built upon how they characterized their citizens to be too scared to protest violently, and that the risk isn't worth it, and it would be a zero-sum game at the end of the day, and that the alternatives that they gave you include asking people who are already privileged to help you, like politicians who are rich, and posting it on social media to gain help from people, and that minority race are at risk because they're targeted because of the violent protests, and it justifies government to use tear gas and violent actions back at these citizens, and that politicians are selfish and greedy and rich and will just run away into a different country to avoid the mess of the violent protests. What did government tell you then? The analysis that government gave you is that when a government faces zero physical or economic resistance, it naturally pushes the boundaries of power, right? Leading to them to being able to more likely do whatever they want, because, simply put, they're not directly affected towards it. This continuous radical protest draws a hard line into this, right? It communicates to the elite power that there is a severe cost to expanding oppressive policies and just letting their state die in hyperinflation and starvation. For the politicians that are rich and won't listen to these citizens, exactly that the politicians are rich and selfish and want power, let's flip the characterization that simply kills their own case, because their alternative relies on these politicians that are already privileged, because they do not want to concede and they do not want to care about these people, because, simply put, they're rich, they don't care, right? Exactly the framing that opposition gives you. Simply put, their alternative cannot work under their side of the house. And government also simply cannot do violent action towards these citizens. It does not justify these government to just because a citizen is doing violent protest does not justify a government to just shoot people on the street and use mass gas tears on the population. And there's a literal international law and human rights frameworks where a government will never be justified in deploying tear gas as a blanket retaliatory measure, even during violent protests. That is a literal law issue. But I think it should be fully weighed on the characterization and the interest of the citizen. Very proud to propose.
Thank you, government reply, for that speech. That concludes the end of the debate. I will stop the recording now.